tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Welcome to the Power of Zero Show. This is your host, best-selling author David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero. Look Before You Lurk, The Volatility Shield, and Tax-Free Income for Life. If you're looking for someone to help you navigate all the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, head on over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, trained, vetted, qualified personally by me. If you're an advisor who wants to incorporate the Power Zero worldview into your financial planning practice, head over to powerzero.com, opt into the 3-part video series. Happy to have a talk with you at any point during that series. Today, I'm going to show you the first half of an interview I had with one of our elite POZ advisors by the name of Mark Byelich, Attleboro Financial out of Pennsylvania. We had a very wide-ranging discussion. It's going to take up 2 episodes. That's how wide-ranging it was. Today, we're going to talk about what's changed to the country's fiscal outlook since the beginning of COVID. We'll talk about the importance of the U.S. government broadening the tax base. We're talking about what you should be doing right now. What should you be thinking about right now in terms of the Power of Zero worldview, Power of Zero planning? We're going to talk about inflation, what's going to happen with inflation in the mid to long term. We're going to talk about, will they ever tax Roth IRAs? And then we're going to talk about means testing for Social Security and Medicare. So sit back, relax, and have a listen to my conversation with Mark Byelich.
So, Dave, we've got a lot to talk about. One of the first things that we have listed in the questions is really what's changed since COVID-19 began. So we were all humming along nicely beginning of 2020, and then the whole world changed. So really, in your opinion, what's changed so much?
Well, a couple of things have changed. We know COVID blew a $6 trillion hole in the economy. And so to build a bridge across that $6 trillion abyss in the economy, they had to print a lot of money. They had to borrow a lot of money. So we know that I was actually watching usdebtclock.org. And I was just, normally it takes about $1 trillion to be added to it takes a year to add $1 trillion to the debt. We added $6 trillion to the debt in just a matter of months. So in what normally takes 6 years happened in about 3 months. I've never seen anything like it in our lives. So what does that really mean? We know that historically we've been told that Social Security sort of runs out of money in 2035. The new estimates are now that it runs out of money in 2032. Medicare, we've been told, would run out of money in 2026. We're now being told it'll run out of money in 2023. So really, COVID-19 has just accelerated all of these events that we've long warned about, namely that our company faces a day of reckoning where these unfunded obligations, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, these 4 expenses are going to cost more and more and more as time wears on. And we've got a couple of things we can do. We can either cut expenses, we can raise revenue, or some combination of the two. I imagine that that's how it's going to play out over the course of the next 10 years. It's awfully hard to, if you're a politician, to cut Social Security and Medicare when baby boomers represent the single largest voting bloc in the country. So I imagine rather than cutting these programs down to size, we're going to face more taxes. We can't just print money. We're in the midst of an inflation wave that's not transitory. So I think that all of these different things that have happened over the course of the last 2 years are pointing towards higher taxes. So the message that I've been preaching for the last 10, 15 years has only intensified based on what's transpired over the last 24 months or so.
Yeah, boy, isn't that true? There have been 2 really strong turning points in my career. And the first one was in 2011. I had just completed my certified financial planner exam and been awarded my designation. And I attended a continuing education done by a fellow named Ed Slott. Now, Dave, I know you know Ed Slott. He wrote a piece in his book, in your book, an introduction, I believe it was. That was for the Power Zero, right? Yeah.
Right.
And I remember sitting in the back of this continuing education in 2011 thinking, I thought I knew everything walking into this room, and I realized what I don't know. So since then, I've been part of Ed's Master Lead Advisor Group since 2011, and Ed's been a mentor of mine. And then the second big turning point was at an Ed Slott conference in San Diego, California, I came back to my seat, and there was a book in front of me called The Power of Zero. And I actually snagged one next to me because the seat was empty, and I brought one home to my partner at the time. But David stood up in front of us, about an audience about 400 people, and did his Power Zero presentation. And it was another blown away moment because, again, I just thought this is a really great way of bringing this important message to you folks who need to hear it. And it was just, again, just an awakening. So I appreciate that, Dave. And so that was, I think, 2015. And since then, you've gifted me the opportunity to meet hundreds of people. And it's so important because everything you just said is very true. We all know that taxes have to increase. There's still people that have to be convinced of that. But the studies that we've done, that my study group, show that the average middle-class American will be in the 40 to 45% effective tax rate, I think, within the next 10 years. And if you don't believe that, and if you don't believe the government is motivated to go after your tax dollars or to start drawing more money out of your bank accounts, just look at what happened in 2022 here with Medicare costs. So your Medicare costs increased, I think it was 43%. I'm kind of working off of memory here, but they didn't increase payroll tax. They didn't, that's another phantom tax. So it wasn't, some kind of soft tax to only the rich. This was a direct pull out of the bank accounts for some people who just can't afford it. So the government they're trying to do everything that they can to access additional dollars. And, they started with Medicare, and that surprised me. Do you have any comments about that?
Let me talk real quick on who's going to bear the brunt. I'm glad you brought it to everyone's attention. Who's going to bear the brunt of all the taxes? And a lot of people think they're just going to raise taxes on the 1%. I know Joe Biden, with his Build Back Better plan, talked about only those who made more than $450,000 would bear the brunt of all of the new expenditures over the arc of the next 10 years. Well, there's a lady by the name of Maya McGinnis, who's the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It's a bipartisan think tank out of Washington, D.C. And they actually did a study and said, okay, what if all they did was tax every dollar above $400,000? How high would the tax have to go just to prevent the national debt from growing by more than $1 trillion per year? This is not to get us down to even. This is not to spend the debt down, just to prevent the debt from growing by more than $1 trillion per year. They realized they'd have to tax every dollar above $400,000 earned above $400,000 at 103%. So they said, whoa, that's not very practical. So let's lower that number down to, say, $250,000. They lowered that down to $250,000. Every dollar earned above $250,000 would have to be taxed at 80% just to prevent the national debt from growing by more than $1 trillion per year. So they said that's not practical either. So they kept lowering and lowering and lowering that threshold to the point where basically what you just said, Mark, is totally true, that we would have to have an effective tax rate on every dollar made above $50,000 of basically 40%. It's an effective tax rate of 40%. So for people who think that the rich are going to bail us out, it's just mathematically not viable. Okay. So eventually the federal government's going to have to broaden the tax base. Everybody's going to fall under the IRS's scope sooner or later, because the rich people don't have enough money to pay for everything that the federal government's promised that they can't afford to deliver. And so that's why we approach this message with such urgency, because the math is not on our side.
Yeah, and what we saw in what came out of the House Ways and Means Committee, and I guess out of Congress too, was when the Build Back Better, it's hard to say, isn't it? Build Back Better plan was also for the first time just a tax on an asset, not even just distribution, because they had that forced, really required minimum distribution. I think it was anything over $10 million in any type of retirement account would have to be distributed. 50% of the overage amount would have to be distributed and then taxed. So that's another way that you're completely out of control of what you're doing with your money. Really, really challenging. So when you hear things like that, David, I mean, really and you do, this is your study, and I talk about your podcast and all the great information that you bring. And often that's additional education for us and really keeping us sharp. And one of the things I really like, by the way, about doing a weekly podcast and doing a weekly webinar and doing these monthly webinars, the special webinars, is I have to stay on top of my game as well, right? There's a lot of prep. You spend hours prepping these things, and that's good. So with all this information you've gleaned, I mean, what should folks be doing right now, knowing that they're going to be in that area? Really, what should they be doing?
Well, so for a long time, I thought that Joe Biden was going to get his Build Back Better through. I thought that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema would eventually sort of come over to his way of thinking. And really what I predicted happening was that, yes, he would raise taxes on the wealthy, but he would also extend the Trump tax cuts for middle-class Americans. And I fully expected him to do that, to extend it under budget reconciliation. He would extend it for another 8 years. So what that means is that instead of having that tax cut expire in 2026, it would go all the way through 2029. So it would start in 2022, 2023, 2024, all the way through 2029. They would revert back to 2017 tax rates in 2030. So I was fully anticipating, starting in 2022, an 8-year extension of the Trump tax cuts for middle-class America. And my most recent podcast that came out today talks about how many people thought that once Manchin gave a firm no on Joe Biden's Build Back Better, that they would come back to the table and try to negotiate. They had a series of negotiations, and then Joe Manchin came back to the table a second time, and he says, it's definitely off. Nothing is happening with this bill. And so I think people have completely written off the Build Back Better. And when you write off the Build Back Better, you also write out the possibility that Biden would extend those tax cuts for middle-class America. So overnight, we went from the hope of having 8 years of historically low tax rates for middle-class America to now these Trump tax cuts for middle-class America are going to revert back to what they were in 2017, starting on January 1st, 2026. So instead of an 8-year window of opportunity within which to get your highly taxable 401ks and IRAs repositioned to tax-free by way of, say, a Roth conversion, for example, you now have 4 years, okay? 4 years of historically low tax rates, which means that somewhat increases the likelihood of bumping up into a higher tax bracket during that 4-year period. And in a perfect world, we would stretch that tax obligation over as long a period as possible. Now we're looking at 4 years. And so what I would tell people is that instead of saying, okay, we only have 4 years, now I'm going to bump up into the 32% tax bracket, I'd say get potentially as much as you can shifted in that 24% tax bracket if you feel comfortable with it. And then starting in 2026, you'll be faced with some, potentially, 25 or 28% taxes if you have to extend that shift out through 2026, 2027, 2028. But I would encourage people to look at taking advantage of these historically low taxes, but don't succumb to the temptation to bump up into the 32% tax bracket, because frankly, I don't think that's a good deal. You're better off paying those 25 or 28% tax bracket rates starting in 2026, 2027. But be thinking that even when 2026 rolls around, 25 and 28 is still not a bad tax rate, considering where tax rates will likely be in 2030 and beyond.
That's extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act always concerned me. It was great for our clients, right? Gives us more time, gets things done, but horrible for the economy or the strength of our country. So it's funny because you have a mixed feeling about that. Again, when I remember you talking about that several months ago, and I think you said that didn't necessarily agree. Ed Slott didn't necessarily agree that was going to happen. And you just don't know what's going to happen in Washington. So it really is a mixed bag. Now, I'll say that I don't necessarily agree with you, Dave, about going into the 32% bracket. There are times when it can make sense. I like to look at the effective tax rate, right? So if you're slightly into it, especially single folks, if you have a single individual that comes to you with millions of dollars, boy, is it tough. You're really up against it. And you're right. We were doing Roth conversions in 2017, 2016, 2015. I started doing all the way back in 2011, as I told you. So it's definitely more challenging, but you can get it done. My concern is that it's going to get a little worse before the end of 2026. It still could go there.
Yeah, that's possible. Working, all other things being equal, I guess what I'm trying to say is if we know, for example, the 25 and the 28% tax bracket will be around in 2026, 2027, you're better off extending that shifting period slightly beyond 2026 than sort of reflexively bumping up into that 32% tax bracket in the meantime. I tend to think that the tax rates go up gradually, but some people are saying that Republicans could get control of everything in 2024, in which case they could extend the Trump tax cuts for another 8 years. The problem that everybody has to remember is that there's always a day of reckoning. When we lower tax rates in the face of exploding debt, we're simply kicking the can down the road. And the fix on the back end is going to be even more severe, even more draconian. Tax rates are going to have to rise even higher on the back end to compensate for all of the tax cuts that, mathematically speaking, were not good for our country in the short term. And so it's that old whipsaw. You can pay me now or pay me later with interest. And what, politicians love to cut taxes in the short term because it wins them votes, but the national debt keeps growing and spiraling out of control, and somebody's going to have to pay that money sooner or later. We can't just print money to service that debt because that has implications of its own. So every year that the debt goes up means the likelihood of higher taxes is more and more real.
Yeah, one thing I want to talk about is you discussed this on one of your podcasts, and I talked about it on a webinar, is everybody's talking about inflation right now. And the Fed has tools to help fight inflation, right? By raising interest rates. That's one of the things that the Fed is required to do, is manage, economic growth and inflation. And the way they manage inflation is raising interest rates. So that's the Fed funds rate. That doesn't necessarily mean the market, right? What the market rates are. But you posited this, and I picked up on that as well. Can the Fed really aggressively raise interest rates because of the service of our national debt? So can you talk about that a little bit, Dave?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Mark. One of the tools they have in their tool bag, as it were, to fight inflation is to raise interest rates. The problem is the reason we're able to sustain all of this debt for such a long period of time is because we've been at historically low interest rates for so long. And so the cost of servicing all this debt today is about the same as what it cost back in 2003 when we only had about $5 trillion of debt. Back then, interest rates were at about 5.5%. Today, they're much lower, about 2%. It's about a third as much. And when I say 2%, I'm talking about with all the different spreads in there. So what's happening is if we get to the point where they raise interest rates in an attempt to sort of mitigate inflation, then the thing that they rub up against is that the cost of servicing the national debt could triple or even quadruple. And when that happens, we'll get to a point where the cost of servicing the national debt consumes the entire federal budget. There won't be anything left to pay for the Smithsonian or national parks or food stamps or Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or any of the other things that the federal government has to pay for year in and year out. Literally, the national debt. And by the way, there's only two things that the Constitution says that the federal government is required to pay. One is Civil War pensions. I think we're out of the woods on that one. But the second one is interest on the national debt. We're constitutionally required to pay that. And so we're going to have to find a way to do that. And how do we do that? We have to raise more revenue. How do you raise more revenue? You raise more taxes.
Yeah, that one item concerns me the most right now in totality with where we are with the markets and inflation. Because inflation's at 7% year over year. As you said, the Fed chairman came out and Janet Yellen came out and said it's not transitory, which means it's going to be here for a while. I read a lot of analyst reports, even one of the most, I don't know how you want to say it, bullish or most conservative as far as inflation, says that they expect inflation to wane by the end of this year to about 2.5% and then return to 3.5% to 4.5% for the next several years. Well, 3.5% and 4.5% or 5% inflation, you start seeing financial plans fail, right? So if we take away the tool out of the toolbox of raising interest rates to help dampen down inflation just because we can't afford the note, because that's what it comes to. It's just like having a variable rate mortgage, and now you can't pay your mortgage, right? And you got to get out of your house, except we can't abandon the house as a government. So that's what concerns me when you're talking about the health of financial plans and investing for clients. They're the things that keep me up at night.
Yeah. And by the way, when the Fed projects these, what inflation will be, there wasn't anybody a year ago that was projecting 7% inflation. So they try to peg inflation at 2%. They try to manipulate interest rates so that inflation comes in at 2% per year. That's exactly what they did last year. They had no idea that inflation was going to be 7%. They didn't have the means of predicting that. And so just because they're predicting it's going to be at 3.5% or 4% doesn't mean anything. It's just a prediction. And it could just as easily fail as their 2% inflation prediction failed from a year ago. And so if we continue to see the printing of money to try to solve our economic problems, if we continue to see debt spiral out of control, all of these things can lead to higher inflation. And it's not transitory.
So we've got a couple questions. Do you mind if I take some questions now, Dave?
Go for it.
All right. This is Roseanne. How are you doing, Roseanne? So this is one we always hear. Moving forward, do you think the federal government will at some point tax Roth withdrawals, she put? So are they going to eventually tax the Roth IRA as well?
Yeah, you got to remember that there aren't very many things in the world that the government likes and members of the general public like, and Roth IRAs is one of them. Why is that the case? Well, the federal government loves Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, Roth conversions because it brings them more revenue today. Well, we as investors and pre-retirees and retirees love it because we can see that tax freight train off in the distance. We can see that it's bearing down on us. We can see that every year that train picks up a little bit more speed. And so we want to shield ourselves from the impact of higher taxes, and Roth IRAs and Roth 401ks and Roth conversions are the way that we do it. So there aren't very many things in the world that the government likes and that we like. And so I don't see anything happening with the Roth IRA anytime soon. And of course, if they started taxing distributions on Roth IRAs, people would stop doing Roth IRAs altogether. And the federal government, frankly, would lose that source of revenue.
Yeah. And don't you think that, so I always think of the importance of getting this set up now because of the grandfathering, right? So if they change something, it's like they may force money out of the Roth IRA, kind of like they do with required minimum distributions for beneficiaries. And what they're talking about now, where if you have more than $10 million in a Roth IRA, now this isn't the law now, this was just what was proposed, but if you had more than $10 million in a Roth IRA, then you would have to take a distribution of 50% of that overage, and you'd have to do that every year, right? But that's a way to pull money back, kind of put it back in taxable circulation. That's possible, but still, it's very unlikely, in my opinion, unless you're going to hit that. You're talking about those larger numbers in Roth IRAs. Let's face it, not a lot of people have $10 million in a Roth IRA, right? And it really came on the back of that $5 billion Roth IRA that the fellow, I forget his name, but the fellow
Peter Thiel, yeah.
Yeah, that's a total one-off. I mean, so really unfortunate.
Okay, that's the episode for today. Once again, if you need help navigating all of the issues we discussed during this podcast, head over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to connect you with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, just like Mark. And if you are a financial advisor, wants to level up your game, head over to powerzero.com. We are happy to connect with you there. Would always love a follow on Twitter at McKnight & Co. at McKnight & Co. If you're looking to buy any of my books in a single copy, you can do that at Amazon or wherever you buy fine books, or you can buy them in bulk. You can mix and match titles and achieve bulk discounts over at davidmcknightbooks.com. Thanks for tuning in this week. We will look forward to chatting with you same time next week.